It's only a chair, stand up. Richard Bennett didn't raise his voice when he said it, and that was what made it worse. The dining room of the colonial house glowed under a crystal chandelier imported from Italy 20 years ago, its light bouncing off polished mahogany and silver cutlery lined with military precision. 20 guests sat around the long table dressed in pressed suits and pastel dresses, wine glasses half full. Conversations pausing just long enough to catch the shift in air as Charlotte Bennett stepped in from the foyer, still carrying the faint chill of the early October evening, 52 degrees outside and dropping. Every proper seat was taken. At the far end of the table, slightly behind her father's chair, stood a narrow wooden chair without cushions, the kind meant for extra guests or children. Richard didn't look at her at first. He kept slicing his prime rib, medium rare, as though discussing quarterly returns. It's only a chair, he repeated, finally glancing up, his pale blue eyes cool and dismissive. Stand up if you have to. We're all family here. A ripple of restrained laughter circled the table, soft, polite, complicit. Charlotte did not flush. She did not defend herself. Her posture remained straight, her black wool coat still buttoned, her heels clicking once against the hardwood as she stepped closer to the table. The scent of rosemary and red wine mingled with old money and older expectations. 2 years ago, she had sat at this same table at the head of marketing for Bennett Holdings, working 70-hour weeks, reviewing contracts past midnight, believing effort translated to belonging. 2 years ago, her name had still been on the internal memos, though never on the ownership papers. She remembered the afternoon her father told her she was too emotional for executive decisions, his voice measured, almost gentle, as he removed her access to company accounts. She remembered packing her framed MBA diploma from Wharton into a cardboard box that cost less than the lunch he was now eating. And she remembered the house, this house, where she had grown up, believing it would always be hers in some invisible way, though the deed had never carried her name. Now she looked at the small wooden chair, and then at the empty space at the table where she once sat during board dinners, and instead of embarrassment there was something steadier in her gaze, something calculated. She set her leather handbag down beside the narrow chair but did not sit. Richard dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin, satisfied with the display. "Don't make a scene, Charlotte," he added lightly, as though she were the one threatening decorum. For a heartbeat, silence stretched across the 12-foot table. Then Charlotte's lips curved, not wide, not theatrical, just enough to soften her face. "It's only a chair," she echoed quietly, her voice even, almost warm. Her fingers brushed the edge of the handbag where a thin white envelope rested inside, the paper crisp, official, waiting. Around them, forks resumed their quiet clinks against china, guests pretending the moment had already passed. But Charlotte did not reach for the chair. She remained standing, composed, as if the absence of a seat beneath her meant nothing at all. Charlotte remained standing long after the laughter settled back into polite conversation, her fingers resting lightly against the leather of her handbag, as if it were nothing more than an accessory instead of a boundary line. From the outside, she looked like a daughter who had simply arrived late to dinner, but inside she was measuring the room the way she once measured quarterly projections, noting who avoided her eyes, who watched her with quiet curiosity, and who seemed relieved that the attention was not on them. 2 years earlier she had stood in a different room, 20 floors above Market Street in downtown Boston, staring at the skyline through a wall of glass, while her father's voice came through the speakerphone telling her the board had decided to restructure leadership, that her position would be dissolved effective immediately, that she should take some time to consider what truly suited her strengths. She had listened without interrupting, her reflection in the window pale against the afternoon sun, the city stretching wide beneath her as if offering space rather than defeat. She had cleared out her office in under 30 minutes, sliding framed photographs into a cardboard box and carrying it past reception without asking anyone to help. The elevator descending 1 floor at a time while the numbers blinked above her head in steady silence. That night she had walked into her townhouse, 600 square feet she had purchased with her own savings, and placed the box on the kitchen counter beside a stainless steel sink and a single lamp casting warm light across the granite. There had been no chandelier, no 12-foot dining table, no audience, just the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of her own breathing. Over the next months, she had built a routine that did not require applause, rising at 5:30 each morning, running 3 miles along the Charles River even when the temperature dropped below 40 degrees, returning home to study case law and financial regulations while coffee brewed in a chipped ceramic mug. She enrolled in advanced courses on asset restructuring and corporate debt acquisition, spending weekends in libraries instead of at galas, learning how leverage moved quietly through contracts rather than loudly through speeches. When former colleagues called to express sympathy, she thanked them and declined invitations to vent. She preferred spreadsheets to bitterness, strategy to complaint. Bennett Holdings, once a fortress in her mind, revealed itself on paper as vulnerable to riskier expansions her father had pursued to maintain status, commercial properties refinanced at aggressive rates, personal guarantees attached to loans that assumed perpetual growth. Charlotte read every line the way she used to read bedtime stories as a child, slowly, deliberately, aware that language could change futures. Back in the dining room, the crystal glasses caught the chandelier light and fractured it into soft prisms across white tablecloths, and Richard continued speaking about market conditions as though nothing significant had shifted. Yet Charlotte could see the faint crease forming between his brows as he noticed she still had not taken the narrow chair. Her coat remained buttoned, her posture calm, and when one of the guests asked whether she had been keeping busy these past 2 years, she answered simply that she had been learning. She did not elaborate. She did not mention the firm she co-founded with 2 quiet partners, or the portfolio of distressed assets they had been assembling with patient precision. She let the word learning rest in the air like something harmless, almost modest, while inside her handbag the white envelope waited, its edges sharp, its timing exact, carrying with it the difference between being asked to stand and choosing when others would have to sit. The word learning lingered over the table like something harmless, and that was exactly how Charlotte intended it. She reached into her handbag with the same unhurried grace she once used to sign executive summaries and withdrew the white envelope, its surface uncreased, the return address printed in clean black ink from a firm that did not carry the Bennett name. She did not slide it across the table immediately. Instead, she placed it beside her untouched wine glass, aligning its edge parallel to the silverware as though presentation mattered as much as content. Richard's gaze dropped to it despite himself, the faint crease between his brows deepening as he recognized the logo embossed in the upper left corner. "Is there something we should know?" he asked, attempting a tone of mild curiosity, but the question carried the tightness of someone who sensed a shift he could not yet define. Charlotte met his eyes, not with defiance, but with clarity. "You might want to read it," she said softly. The guests fell quiet again, forks pausing halfway to plates, the soft hum of the heating system suddenly noticeable in the ceiling above. Richard did not reach for the envelope at first. He wiped his hands with deliberate care, folded his napkin, then finally extended his fingers and drew the paper toward him. The room seemed to narrow to the width of that single sheet as he opened it. Charlotte watched without blinking, her heartbeat steady, the way it had been the morning she signed the acquisition agreement in a conference room overlooking the harbor, her 2 partners seated on either side of her, the contract spread across polished oak, the view of gray Atlantic waters stretching beyond the glass. Back then, she had read every clause twice before lifting her pen. Now she did not need to read it all. Richard's eyes moved across the page, scanning lines that referenced loan covenants, missed interest payments, and the transfer of debt obligations to a new holding entity. His jaw tightened. One of the guests cleared his throat, attempting to lighten the mood with a comment about refinancing trends, but the words dissolved as Richard's hand stilled. "This is a mistake," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. Charlotte remained composed. "It is a notice of default and intent to enforce," she replied, her tone as neutral as a market report. The firm listed at the top of the page, Bennett Capital Partners, was not one he could dismiss as an outsider's interference. He knew the name. He had seen it in recent trade publications. a rising investment group specializing in distressed assets with strategic patience. What he had not known, what he had not imagined, was that Charlotte's quiet months of learning had been laying the groundwork for this exact evening. 2 months earlier, when Bennett Holdings had struggled to meet a balloon payment on a commercial property outside Providence, the secondary lender had quietly sold the debt. The buyer had not sought publicity. The buyer had waited. Now, at the head of the table beneath imported crystal and inherited pride, Richard understood that the house itself had been used as collateral to secure a line of credit that bridged that gap. 30 days. That was the timeline outlined in precise legal language. 30 days to satisfy the debt in full or surrender the property under the terms he had signed. He looked up at Charlotte, searching her face for anger, for triumph, for any sign of reckless revenge. He found none. She stood exactly where he had told her to stand, balanced, steady, her coat still buttoned against the October chill that lingered in the air whenever the front door opened. Around them, the guests lowered their eyes, no longer amused, no longer certain where allegiance belonged. Charlotte did not raise her voice. She did not explain her journey or recite the hours she had spent studying contracts, while others underestimated her. She simply allowed the silence to do what it does best when power changes hands. "You should sit," she said at last, her gaze flicking briefly to the narrow wooden chair before returning to him, not as a daughter seeking approval, but as a creditor exercising rights written in ink. The word creditor settled into the room with more weight than any accusation could have carried, and for a long moment no one moved, not even the servers waiting discreetly by the kitchen doors. Richard's fingers tightened around the edge of the paper as if pressure alone could alter the terms printed in black ink, and Charlotte watched the shift in him the way she once watched market indicators turn from green to red, not with excitement, but with recognition. She had seen this phase before, the refusal to believe the numbers, the instinct to question the legitimacy of what could not be controlled. "You cannot possibly think this is enforceable," he said, lowering his voice, attempting to reclaim authority through composure. Charlotte did not sit. She removed her coat slowly and draped it over the back of the narrow wooden chair, claiming it without occupying it, a quiet statement that space no longer required permission. "It is enforceable," she replied, her tone even, almost instructional, the way she had explained complex clauses to clients who underestimated fine print. 2 months earlier she had stood in a different dining room, one without chandeliers, meeting with her legal team over takeout containers and printed drafts, reviewing the collateral attached to Bennett Holdings' line of credit. She had not celebrated when she learned the family estate had been pledged as security. She had only nodded and asked for confirmation of recording dates and lien priority. She had insisted on patience then, declining to accelerate the debt immediately, allowing interest to accrue within lawful limits, ensuring that when the notice was delivered there would be no technical weakness to exploit. Back in the present, a cousin across the table shifted uncomfortably and murmured something about market fluctuations, but Charlotte's attention remained on her father. The chandelier light caught the silver in his hair as he scanned the final paragraph again, the one outlining the 30-day window to cure the default. 30 days in which liquidity would have to materialize from somewhere other than pride. "You would force your own family out of their home," he said, the word force chosen carefully, as if framing the narrative might restore leverage. Charlotte tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, but in clarity. "The terms were agreed upon long before I was involved," she answered. "I simply acquired the position." It was not anger that steadied her voice, it was memory. She remembered standing in this same house at 16 years old, asking to join a summer finance program and being told that such ambition was unnecessary, that she would marry well and have comfort without strain. She remembered studying anyway, filling spiral notebooks with calculations at the edge of her bed, believing competence could bridge the gap between expectation and respect. Years later, when she presented a restructuring proposal to preserve the company during an early downturn, Richard had dismissed it as overly cautious. The expansion that followed had impressed shareholders for a season, then stretched credit beyond safety. Now the consequences sat folded in his hands. Charlotte stepped closer to the table, not invading. Not towering, simply aligning herself within the circle from which she had once been subtly excluded. There are options, she continued, not as a daughter seeking reconciliation, but as a managing partner outlining realities. The debt can be satisfied. Assets can be liquidated. Or the property transfers under the agreement. She did not mention that her firm had already evaluated the estate's market value, calculating renovation costs and projected returns should it be converted into a boutique corporate retreat. That analysis belonged to her world, not this one. Around the table, the earlier laughter felt distant, replaced by the quiet awareness that hierarchy had shifted without raised voices or dramatic gestures. Richard set the paper down slowly, his gaze lifting to meet hers fully for the first time that evening, no longer dismissive, no longer amused. Charlotte stood steady beside the small wooden chair, not occupying it, not needing to, her presence itself now the fixed point around which the room seemed to recalibrate. No one resumed eating. The roast on porcelain plates cooled beneath the chandelier while the reality of numbers replaced the comfort of tradition, and Charlotte felt the familiar clarity that came when emotion receded and structure remained. She had not come to dismantle the evening. She had come to establish terms. Richard leaned back slowly in his chair, the leather creaking beneath a weight that was no longer only physical, and for the first time since she entered the room he studied her without dismissal, as though recalculating a variable he had long ignored. "You are prepared to take possession," he said carefully, the words tasting foreign. Charlotte did not answer immediately. She moved around the table with measured steps, the heels of her shoes tapping lightly against hardwood floors polished for decades by staff whose names few guests remembered. She stopped near the fireplace where framed family photographs lined the mantel, images of holidays, graduations, charity galas, all curated evidence of continuity. She looked at one photograph in particular, taken 10 years earlier, showing her standing beside her father at a groundbreaking ceremony for a commercial development in Cambridge. She remembered the way he had introduced her that day, not as future leadership, but as support. The memory did not sting now. It informed. "Possession is one outcome," she said at last, turning back toward the table. "Resolution is another." She explained without haste that her firm had evaluated the total outstanding balance, including accrued interest and penalties, and that a structured repayment plan could be negotiated if collateral was reallocated and certain non-performing assets were liquidated within 30 days. She spoke in specifics, referencing square footage, estimated appraisal values, projected timelines measured in weeks rather than hopes measured in pride. The guests listened as though overhearing a boardroom briefing instead of a family dispute. Richard's jaw tightened again, not from disbelief this time, but from recognition that she understood the landscape in detail. "You would dismantle what I built," he said, though the accusation lacked heat. Charlotte shook her head once, calm and restrained. "What was built is already leveraged," she replied. "I am offering stability." The word stability lingered with quiet authority. 2 years ago she had sat alone at her kitchen counter reviewing case studies on generational businesses that collapsed under unmanaged expansion, noting patterns that repeated with predictable rhythm. She had resolved then that if she ever held influence, she would favor sustainability over spectacle. Now, standing in the house where spectacle once defined success, she embodied that principle without raising her voice. A distant clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, each note clear and unhurried, marking the passage of minutes that felt heavier than hours. Richard glanced toward the windows where darkness pressed against glass panes imported from Europe decades earlier, and for a moment he looked older, not diminished, but aware. "And if I refuse?" he asked quietly. Charlotte met his gaze evenly. "Then the agreement proceeds as written." No threat colored her tone, only fact. She returned to the narrow wooden chair and this time rested her hand on its back, claiming the space not through defiance, but through balance. Around the table, alliances recalibrated silently. Admiration replaced amusement in more than one pair of eyes. Charlotte did not seek apology. She did not ask for acknowledgement. She had learned that power stated softly often travels farther than power announced loudly. The envelope remained on the table between them, no longer a surprise but a contract, and in the stillness that followed it became clear that the evening was no longer about where she would sit, but about who now determined the terms of the room. The chandelier light seemed steadier now, as if the room itself had accepted the shift and was adjusting to a new center of gravity, and Charlotte could sense the attention of every guest even when they pretended to study their plates. She did not relish the silence, but she did not rush to fill it either. Richard remained seated at the head of the table, shoulders squared out of habit rather than certainty, the envelope resting beside his plate like an unwelcome guest who would not leave. "You planned this," he said after a moment, his voice lower than before, no longer performing for the room. Charlotte considered the word planned and found no reason to deny it. "I prepared," she answered calmly. Preparation had begun the night she carried that cardboard box into her 600-square-foot townhouse and realized that security could not depend on approval. She had mapped out scenarios the way some people map vacations, calculating risk exposure, identifying leverage points, and studying not only her father's company, but the broader market cycles that influenced it. When interest rates began to rise 18 months ago, she had predicted strain on overextended portfolios. When Bennett Holdings refinanced the Providence property at a variable rate, she had noted the vulnerability. None of it had been personal at the time. It had been structural. Now structure had intersected with family. Richard exhaled slowly, glancing around the table as though searching for reinforcement, but the earlier laughter had dissolved into quiet observation. One guest, a longtime business associate, cleared his throat and asked in careful tones whether mediation might be possible. Charlotte welcomed the question with a slight nod. "Mediation is always possible," she said. "My firm prefers resolution over disruption." The word disruption lingered, deliberately understated. She explained that a formal meeting could be scheduled within 72 hours, that financial disclosures would be required, that any proposal must be grounded in verifiable assets rather than projected prestige. She spoke in specifics, referencing dollar amounts, timelines measured in days, and compliance requirements that left little room for improvisation. Richard listened without interrupting, the weight of procedure settling where pride once dominated. The narrow wooden chair remained beside her, untouched yet symbolically claimed, her coat draped over it like a quiet flag of presence. A server approached uncertainly, asking whether dessert should be brought out, and Richard hesitated before shaking his head. "Not tonight," he said softly. The decision carried more surrender than the refusal of cake. Charlotte noticed the subtle tremor in his hand as he folded the notice once more and slid it back into the envelope. For the first time that evening, he did not look at her as a child who had overstepped, but as an equal across a negotiation table. 30 days, he murmured, almost to himself. Charlotte inclined her head. 30 days, she confirmed. She did not remind him that deadlines could motivate clarity. She did not mention the contingency plans already drafted should no payment materialize. Those details remained in her world of spreadsheets and legal briefs. Instead, she allowed the clock in the hallway to resume its quiet ticking, each second steady and impartial. The guests began to rise slowly from their chairs, conversations subdued, coats retrieved without ceremony. Charlotte slipped her own coat back on, smoothing the lapel with practiced calm. Before turning toward the door, she met her father's gaze one last time, not with triumph, not with bitterness, but with composed certainty. The balance of power had shifted not through raised voices or spectacle, but through knowledge applied at the precise moment it mattered, and as she stepped out into the cool October night, the air felt clean, measured, and entirely her own. 3 days later, the formal meeting took place not in the dining room beneath crystal light, but in a glass-walled conference suite overlooking the Boston Harbor. 22 floors above the street where traffic moved in disciplined lines and the Atlantic wind pressed white ripples across dark water, Charlotte arrived 10 minutes early. Placing a slim portfolio on the polished table and reviewing the printed statements her analysts had finalized at dawn. She wore a charcoal suit tailored with quiet precision, no jewelry except a thin gold watch, her expression composed not out of coldness, but alignment. When Richard entered with his attorney and chief financial officer, he carried himself with the same upright posture that once commanded boardrooms, yet there was calculation in his eyes now rather than dismissal. The room felt neutral, stripped of family photographs and inherited history, defined instead by square footage, glass, and measurable outcomes. They exchanged restrained greetings and took their seats across from one another, the long table between them no longer symbolic of hierarchy but of negotiation. Charlotte began without preamble, outlining the outstanding principal, accrued interest to date, and the projected increase over the next 30 days if unpaid. She referenced specific properties in Providence and Hartford, detailing occupancy rates, revenue gaps, and refinance feasibility based on current market benchmarks. Her voice carried evenly through the room, steady as the tide outside. Richard listened, occasionally glancing at his attorney, who made notes but did not interrupt. When he finally spoke, his tone was controlled. "We can liquidate the Hartford property within 6 weeks," he said. "The buyer has shown interest." Charlotte inclined her head slightly. 6 weeks exceeds the contractual window," she replied, sliding a document across the table that illustrated alternative scenarios, including a bridge loan contingent upon partial asset transfer. There was no gloating in her posture, no visible satisfaction, only confidence. The chief financial officer cleared his throat and asked about potential restructuring terms should additional collateral be offered. Charlotte responded with precision, outlining ratios and conditions without softening the realities. She did not refer to him as father in this room. She referred to him by last name when necessary, maintaining professional distance that felt both deliberate and respectful. Outside the window, a ferry cut across the harbor, its wake widening in quiet arcs, and for a moment Richard's gaze drifted toward it before returning to her. "You have positioned yourself well," he said finally, not as a compliment but as acknowledgement. Charlotte met his eyes without flinching. "I position the firm," she answered. "This is about solvency." The attorney reviewed the proposed repayment structure, calculating implications, while silence settled in measured intervals between sentences. No raised voices. No accusations. Only numbers shifting from abstract to urgent. After nearly 90 minutes of discussion, Richard leaned back and exhaled slowly, the sound restrained yet unmistakable. "We will transfer the Hartford property and accept the bridge terms," he said at last. 30 days remains the deadline for full compliance. Charlotte nodded once, neither triumphant nor surprised. "The documentation can be drafted today," she replied. Papers were signed, hands shaken, signatures placed beneath clauses that transformed pride into obligation. As they stood to leave, Richard paused, studying her face as if searching for remnants of the daughter he once underestimated. What he found instead was steadiness shaped by discipline. Charlotte gathered her portfolio and walked toward the elevator, the harbor stretching wide behind her, aware that this confrontation was not destruction but recalibration, and that the balance established in this room would echo far beyond it. The transfer documents were finalized within a week, and the Hartford property changed hands with quiet efficiency, its title reassigned through signatures rather than spectacle. Charlotte reviewed the confirmation email in her office just after 7 in the morning, sunlight reflecting off the harbor and casting pale gold lines across her desk. The bridge agreement now stood active, binding Bennett Holdings to structured repayments under strict timelines, and for the first time in years the company's expansion was no longer fueled by assumption, but by accountability. She did not celebrate. Instead, she adjusted projections, recalculated exposure, and ensured compliance triggers were clearly defined. Across the city, Richard stood in his own office studying revised balance sheets that no longer granted him unchecked flexibility. The sale of the Hartford property had stabilized immediate risk, but it had also signaled to industry observers that Bennett Holdings was recalibrating under external oversight. Analysts began to mention Bennett Capital Partners in the same conversations, noting the firm's disciplined acquisition strategy and its willingness to enforce terms without theatrics. At a quarterly investor luncheon held at a downtown hotel overlooking Copley Square, the shift became visible. Charlotte attended not as a daughter, but as managing partner, seated at a round table near the stage where executives discussed market forecasts. Richard arrived shortly after, his presence still commanding attention, yet the dynamic in the room felt altered. Several investors approached Charlotte first, referencing the Hartford transaction and praising the clarity of the restructuring plan. She responded with measured gratitude, emphasizing data over drama, discipline over dominance. When Richard finally joined the small circle forming around her, there was no hostility in his expression, only recognition of changed context. "Your firm has earned respect," he said quietly, not as concession but as fact. Charlotte met his gaze evenly. "Respect follows performance," she replied, her tone professional, neither warm nor cold. During the panel discussion, a moderator referenced recent volatility in commercial real estate and invited questions from the audience. Richard spoke thoughtfully about risk management and the importance of adapting legacy businesses to evolving markets. Charlotte listened, noting the subtle shift in his language from expansion to sustainability. When she was later invited to comment on distressed asset strategy, she outlined her philosophy with clarity, explaining that leverage must be matched with resilience, that growth without safeguards becomes fragile. The audience responded with attentive silence, rather than polite applause. It was the kind of silence that signals consideration. After the luncheon, as attendees dispersed into the bright afternoon, Richard walked beside her toward the elevators. The hallway was lined with mirrored panels reflecting their parallel steps, neither ahead of the other. "You could have taken the house," he said, not accusingly, but thoughtfully. Charlotte paused before the elevator doors, pressing the button with steady fingers. "I chose structure," she answered. The doors opened, and they stepped inside along with two investors who nodded respectfully to her. No further explanation was necessary. Outside, the city moved with its usual rhythm, taxis passing, pedestrians crossing under the late spring sun, unaware of the recalibration that had taken place within boardrooms and dining rooms alike. Charlotte returned to her office, reviewing compliance updates and confirming that the next repayment milestone was on schedule. She did not dwell on the past slight about a chair, nor did she replay the moment of confrontation. What remained was alignment between authority and accountability. In the months that followed, Bennett Holdings met its obligations under the structured plan, and industry publications cited the disciplined turnaround as a case study in controlled correction rather than collapse. Charlotte continued to build her firm with the same steady precision, aware that influence maintained quietly often endures longer than influence declared loudly. Autumn returned to Boston with the same quiet chill that had marked the evening of that dinner months earlier, but the air felt different now, less charged, more defined. The structured repayment plan had been honored in full, each milestone met within the 30-day windows, and the final confirmation arrived on a gray Tuesday morning in a concise email stating that Bennett Holdings had satisfied its obligations under the bridge agreement. Charlotte read the message without visible reaction, then forwarded it to her partners with a single line acknowledging completion. There was no champagne in her office, no announcement sent to industry media. Stability had been the objective, and stability had been achieved. That evening, she received an invitation to a small family gathering at the estate, a quiet dinner rather than a spectacle, framed not as a celebration, but as a gesture of continuity. She considered it for a long moment before accepting. When she arrived, the house looked unchanged from the outside, white columns standing firm against the deepening blue sky, lights glowing warmly behind tall windows. Inside, the long table had been set again, though fewer guests filled the chairs this time, and the atmosphere carried restraint instead of performance. Richard stood near the fireplace speaking softly with a cousin, and when he saw her, he stepped forward without hesitation. There was no smirk, no calculated remark. "Thank you for coming," he said, his tone direct. Charlotte nodded once, her coat folded neatly over her arm. She noticed that an even seat had been left open beside the center of the table, neither elevated nor diminished. She took it without comment. Dinner unfolded with measured conversation about market trends, travel plans, and the changing skyline of the city. No one referenced debt or deadlines, yet the memory of them lingered like a lesson fully absorbed. At one point, a relative asked Charlotte about her firm's recent acquisition in New York, and she explained the strategy with quiet clarity, emphasizing risk management and long-term resilience. Richard listened, occasionally adding perspective, but never interrupting. The exchange felt balanced, not rehearsed. After dessert, when most guests drifted toward the sitting room, Richard remained at the table. The chandelier cast soft reflections across the polished wood, and for a moment father and daughter sat across from one another in unguarded silence. "You handled it professionally," he said finally. "I underestimated you." The admission was not dramatic, yet it carried weight. Charlotte did not rush to fill the pause that followed. "You underestimated the structure," she replied gently. "Not me." A faint smile touched his expression, not of superiority, but of recognition. The clock in the hallway chimed 9, steady and impartial, marking time without preference. Charlotte rose from her chair, smoothing her jacket with the same composed motion she had practiced for years. She did not seek apology beyond what had been offered, and she did not require validation beyond performance. As she walked toward the front door, the cool night air greeted her once more, crisp and clean against her skin. The estate remained standing behind her, no longer a symbol of inherited authority, but of recalibrated respect. She paused at the top of the stone steps, looking out at the quiet street illuminated by soft streetlights, aware that victory had not been about possession or humiliation, but about alignment. She had not needed to reclaim a seat to prove her worth. She had built her own table, defined her own terms, and in doing so transformed confrontation into equilibrium. In the stillness of that autumn night, it was clear that she had not conquered her father, she had outgrown the need to.